The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain-link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Marek almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain-link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Marek knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Marek checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the third night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain-link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway. because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Marek did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Marek wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Marek stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet map. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fair. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The stories. The librarian who reopened maps after one voicemail. The voicemail hit the library phone system at 9:16 in the morning, and staff noted the time on the call sheet. The town's map room had been shuttered since 2016 for budget reasons, with the keys sealed in a gray envelope. Rhea Calder was 38 and worked as a reference librarian, and she was supposed to weed duplicate travel guides. She liked lists and quiet projects that finished by closing time, and she intended to be home before the streetlights switched on. She opened the staff mailbox for routine messages, and the new voicemail had a subject line that looked wrong. The timestamp matched today, yet the voice sounded grainy and old, like cassette tape found in a hot attic. The caller sounded rushed but clear, and he used a steady dispatcher tone that carried through the static. He said the emergency detour map in the bridge packet had its north arrow wrong, and the depot road turn would strand drivers. He named 2 intersections locals would recognize, and he said the paper copy got flipped during a late-night duplication. He asked whoever heard this to check the flat files in the public map room, and then he hung up fast. Rhea paused because the library was planning a small display for the bridge reopening next week. The town crew wanted visitors to see old blueprints and printed maps, and the staff had quietly promised to unseal the room. She replayed the message and wrote down every location, and she typed the intersections into the library catalog notes. The bridge packet sat behind the desk in a manila folder, and she slipped the detour sheet out with a quiet tug. The detour looked normal at first glance, and the label fonts matched the county style guide. The north arrow pointed toward the top of the page, and a thick red line wrapped through 3 turns like a ribbon She looked for a small staff stamp, and there it was near the border in faint purple. It said copied from firehouse drawer after warehouse incident, which the old reference notebook linked to 2009. Her job and training lived in the overlaps between paper and people, and she felt the old itch to confirm. The warehouse incident had clogged the streets for days, and archived calls reportedly mentioned bad directions at least twice. She brought the folder to the workroom and pulled the microfilm drawer, and the metal slides rasped against old paint. Dispatch logs on film listed closed streets and detours, and operators marked trouble points with pencil circles. Two logs from the same night mentioned Depot Road, and the note said trucks turned the wrong way toward the river. One line said, "See temporary detour plate beside flat file B," which sounded like a direct breadcrumb. Flat file B waited in the locked room behind the genealogy shelves, and the envelope with the keys lived in a safe. She signed a paper acknowledging responsibility for access, and she carried the keys with both hands like a relic. The map room smelled like dust and linen, and the ceiling fan ticked from a loose blade. She slid open a drawer and found rolled sheets, and brittle plastic sleeves stuck to their neighbors like leaves after rain. The temporary detour plate was a stiff board with a taped photocopy, and someone had written mirror warning in grease pencil. The north arrow had a big X over it, and a second arrow pointed to the right side with the word up. She spread the board on a table and placed washers on the corners, and the paper fought to curl back into memory. The Depot Road turn looked reversed compared to the packet, and the red line as drawn would lead drivers into gravel. Her phone compass showed north toward the windows, and the temporary plate matched her reading within a few degrees. The packet map disagreed by a wide margin, and her stomach tightened like it always did when details misbehaved. She printed a recent aerial photo from the county website, and she centered on Depot Road and the bridge approach. A water tower shadow ran northeast by the clock, and that matched the plate, but not the packet. She called Tomas Brink, who was 54 and ran maintenance, and she asked about the packet source. He said a volunteer scanned old map holders in the spring, and staff patched labels onto the county base. He remembered a late-night copy job at the firehouse during the warehouse week, and he thought someone flipped a master. He had no hard proof, but he told her to talk with a retired cartographer who lived near the marsh. The cartographer was named Lyda Morell, and she was 71 with careful eyes and a faded canvas jacket. Lyda said she had drawn the original emergency plates on Mylar, and she always sketched north as a small star. Lyda remembered the night the plates went missing, and she spoke like a teacher marking a board after a test. The firehouse copier worked only on the legal tray that night, and someone fed the plate upside down, then pressed copy twice. Lyda said her handwriting on the board looked like her early notes, and she pointed to the grease pencil word up. She kept a photo from that week that showed two volunteers holding the board outside, and the sun angle matched. Rhea asked if the board ever returned to the library, and Lyda shrugged like she had told this story several times. She said yes, the board came back 2 days later, and someone tucked it into drawer B and shut the room. Rhea documented everything as if the board could grow legs and escape, and she wrote dates beside each step. She took photos of the board and the packet, and she copied the microfilm lines, and she initialed each printed page. The voicemail still bothered her, because the timestamp said today, yet the content smelled like an old headache. She checked the library phone system logs, and a vendor note explained a recent server migration for stored voicemail. An alert said a batch of delayed messages had been flushed to mailboxes, and the explanation used dry language and disclaimers. She asked the vendor to search for the caller number, and they returned an old service name with a billing code. The code matched a dispatch line used during the warehouse week, which explained the voice and the choice of words. Someone had recorded this warning years ago, and the system had kept it like a seed in a jar. Rhea asked if the caller name could be released, and the vendor sent a redacted sheet with initials and a job title. A local news archive matched the initials to a night guard who reportedly died of natural causes in his parked car. The guard had phoned the correction before the medical event, and he had tried to reach any desk that could fix the map. His message never reached a human while the roads were jammed, and the bad copy camped in a drawer. Rhea brought her notes to Tomas, and he carried the folder to a brief meeting with the town clerk. The clerk asked for confirmations and a plan, and Rhea offered a clear sequence that would be easy to retrace next year. Step 1 was to treat the packet map as untrustworthy and to replace it with a fresh export from the county base. Step 2 was to reconcile the arrow with on-site compass readings and to annotate with the date and the staff initials. Step 3 was to scan the temporary board and let the grease pencil speak and to place its image in the appendix. Step 4 was to add a small note in the bridge display and to credit anonymous archival materials for clarifying the route. Tomas drove to Depot Road with her after lunch, and they parked near a mailbox whose nameplate had peeled away. The river ran dull and brown beside the road, and a detour sign leaned like a tired person after a long shift. Rhea stood where the red line on the packet would have sent traffic, and she looked through cottonwoods at rough gravel. The correct route followed a narrow paved lane to the east, and the wrong turn aimed drivers toward a soft shoulder. A school bus rolled past on the narrow lane, and the driver waved like this was already muscle memory. The aerial photo printed in the morning matched the bus path, and the packet map did not. They stopped by a small clinic 2 turns away, and the nurse behind the counter remembered the warehouse week. The clinic took calls from stranded drivers, and a nurse reportedly walked out to redirect a line of cars at sundown. The town clerk approved the correction that afternoon, and the county uploaded a clean detour with verified arrows. Tomas signed off on new signs, and the bridge crew shrugged like this was just another Tuesday with wet concrete. Rhea asked for permission to open the map room weekly, and the clerk looked toward the budget with a careful tilt. The request had no funding yet, but the clerk liked the argument that open rooms produce fewer expensive mistakes. They agreed on a one-afternoon schedule under staff supervision, and Rhea posted a notice near the staircase. She placed the temporary board in a display case with a modest label, and she kept the packet map below it with a sticky note. The sticky note said obsolete and see corrected version, and she included the date and her initials for future sanity. A footnote in the display explained that a delayed voicemail triggered the review and no personal names appeared. At the reopening of the bridge, the mayor shook hands and cut a ribbon, and the appetizers ran out fast. Drivers moved through the new approach like water down a smooth bed, and the detour signs wandered into storage. Tomas clapped her shoulder near the coffee urn, and he said quiet fixes rarely get banners, which is the point. Lyda visited the display the next morning, and she pressed her fingers against the glass like she was reading Braille. Rhea listened to the old voicemail one more time, and the voice had that tired confidence that comes from night work. He had said, please check the flat files, and it felt like he was speaking across a hallway rather than across years. On her desk, she kept a small notebook with 3 lines that she repeated when projects became slippery. Write down names of things as they are used, compare them to how they look on paper, test the direction with the Sunday. She added a 4th line in light ink to mark the lesson that felt both new and as old as maps. If a voice says the arrow is wrong, open the drawer before the parade trucks roll and the cameras arrive. In the months that followed, the room gathered quiet visitors, and the fan still ticked, but less often after tightening. Folks brought rolled plats from garages, and Rhea labeled them carefully, then scanned and returned them with fresh sleeves. A contractor volunteered 2 hours a week to help with filing, and he taught her to spot scale bars that lied. Teachers brought students to trace creeks with cotton thread, and one kid noticed a benchmark star on the courthouse steps. The bridge display came down after the season changed, and the temporary board went back into drawer B with a proper sleeve. A small typed note inside the sleeve told the story in 12 lines, with dates and initials and measured claims. It said a voicemail arrived and matched earlier dispatch references, and staff verified the arrow with compass and aerial evidence. It said a clean map replaced the packet version before the reopening, and the town's roads agreed. Rhea did not call it a miracle, and she did not call it fate, because both words would cheapen 12 careful steps. She called it library work, which sounded plain, yet it held more weight now that a ribbon had been cut. On quiet afternoons, she stood at the window where the compass had pointed, and she felt the same small pull. North was where the light made honest shapes on paper, and where a tired voice could still find the right room. When she locked the door each week, she thought about the man who made the call, and she wished he had been heard. His warning crossed an odd gap in the system, and it landed like a folded note slid under a door. In a town where stories often arrive secondhand, the plain ones sometimes carry the longest mileage. One message, one board, one arrow corrected, and a room reopened so a drawer could be opened without ceremony. The teacher missing from Cold Springs Elementary. Parents in Placerville still mention a teacher who left her classroom keys on the desk, stepped into the breezeway, and vanished. The building sits north of Main Street, where the oak trees break the summer wind and buses idle near the loop. Afternoon bell lines faded under traffic noise while a janitor rolled a static scarred cart toward the multipurpose room. No one noticed anything unusual until the office printer kept spitting forms long after the halls went quiet. Her name in district rosters is Janine Clark, 34, fifth grade teacher, in town to finish a contracted year. She rented a small studio south of Broadway, reportedly quiet, and kept a habit of walking to work before sunup. Colleagues described careful lesson plans stacked by week and a folded cardigan tucked inside a drawer near the class library. County file from 2009 shows a previous placement in Humboldt County with satisfactory notes and no disciplinary flags. On a warm Thursday in late May of 2019, the office clock read 3:20 when dismissal wrapped. Several students returned for forgotten lunchboxes, one parent asked about reading logs, and buses pulled away. Janine signed the dismissal sheet, placed 2 graded packets in a labeled bin, and told the secretary she would lock up. Dispatch logs later noted a routine call about a stalled sedan on Placerville Drive, unrelated, around the same window. The custodian that week was Arthur Mendez, 57. Night shift, on site to prep the gym for a community meeting. He said he saw Janine cross the breezeway with a manila folder under one arm, moving toward the staff room. He remembered a quick wave and a half smile, nothing hurried, and a quiet hallway where the trophy case hummed. His statement says he kept mopping by the south doors until the wax turned even and the clock hit 4. At 4:15, according to archive notes kept by the principal, a substitute teacher named Erin stopped by the copier. She noticed the machine running with no one nearby, pages in neat stacks, and a sticky note asking to refill paper. The sticky note showed Janine's looping script, though investigators never confirmed the note's exact time because the ink bled slightly. Erin said she refilled the tray, gathered the stacks, and left them on the counter under a laminated safety poster. State records show the district uses a keycard system that logs exterior entries, though interior movement remains untracked. The card assigned to Janine recorded entry at 6:51 that morning, and no exit swipe appears that afternoon. Investigators cautioned that propped doors near the breezeway could bypass the system, and some locals claimed staff sometimes did that. Maintenance logs mention hinge repairs on the east exit, possibly encouraging the practice when the wind pressed hard against the frame. A parent volunteer named Samuel Wright, 41, delivery driver, on-site to stack donated books, offered a different recollection. He carried 2 boxes toward the library when he heard a short conversation from the staff room that he could not parse. He saw a figure in a blue jacket by the vending machine, not a teacher he recognized, facing the window. He did not see Janine, and he reported the detail only after reading a notice requesting timelines the following Monday. Investigators mapped movements on a campus diagram printed from county archives using colored pins to mark estimated positions and times. The staff room window faces a small garden where students grow tomatoes, and a service gate opens toward the back lot. Security cameras cover the front entrance and the bus loop, leaving the service gate and breezeway without recording. Some locals claimed a camera once watched the breezeway, though budget minutes do not confirm any equipment there during that year. Janine's sedan remained in the parking row closest to the flagpole when deputies arrived around 7 after a delayed call. She kept a reusable water bottle in the cup holder and a spiral notebook on the passenger seat with math notes. The engine was cold and the windows were cracked a finger width, which is common when classrooms run warm in May. A small tote in the back seat contained graded essays bundled with twine and a paper marked for revision. Her phone pinged the tower near Bedford Avenue until 4:27, then showed no further activity that day. A records technician later explained that coverage drops inside certain parts of the building, especially near the inner hall. Investigators never confirmed whether the device powered down or lost battery because the handset was not recovered. The district retains a bring-your-own-device policy, which complicates retrieval of carrier details without a separate order. County file from 2009 includes an older missing person from the same district, though the circumstances differ widely. That case involved a grounds worker who left during a winter storm and returned 2 days later without explanation. Some locals claimed a pattern, but the sheriff publicly said the comparison did not hold and records conflict on timing. The archived notes from that earlier incident emphasize exhausted staffing and slow road clearance rather than campus conditions. A neighbor at Janine's complex told deputies she heard footsteps outside the unit around 5:45 that morning. She described keys clinking and a short cough, which matches a routine Janine mentioned at a staff wellness meeting. The neighbor did not see anyone that afternoon, and she thought Janine would attend a training on the following day. That training appears in district calendars, location marked as the county office, which aligns with emails recovered from the principal's account. A week later, search teams walked the trails behind the school where oak leaves gather in dry gullies. They checked culverts near the water district fence and traced the drainage channel that runs toward the old railroad grade. Cadaver dogs alerted once near a cluster of trash cans, then lost interest, which handlers later described as inconsistent. Investigators never confirmed that alert because wind and heat had shifted and the cans had been emptied earlier that morning. Friends from her previous post in Humboldt County described a cautious person who favored steady routines over last-minute plans. She called her mother on Sundays, kept receipts in envelopes by month, and logged miles for tax records with tidy lines. In Placerville, she reportedly joined a small literacy group that met near Cedar Ravine on alternating Thursdays for practice tutoring. Attendance sheets show 3 meetings in April and early May, and her name appears on each page in neat print. The principal told investigators that budget season pulled staff into long hours and multiple hiring files stacked on her desk. She said she spoke briefly with Janine about a special education referral, and she promised to follow up by email. That email exists in the server archive, timestamped 112, with a short reply from Janine at 1:14. The reply references a student name that is redacted in released records, which limits independent confirmation of the context. Several community members recalled seeing a white pickup near the service gate at approximately 4, parked crooked with no emblem. A grounds crew worker said the truck belonged to a vendor who repaired drinking fountains, though the schedule lists no visit. Investigators never confirmed the plate because the gate camera did not exist, and statements vary on the exact bumper stickers. Some locals claimed they saw a ladder in the bed, while others remembered a cooler and a tangle of rope. The custodian Arthur later clarified that he locked the East Hall at 4:30, then walked toward the dumpsters. He said the sky had turned pale with high cirrus, and the gym smelled like fresh varnish from the morning coat. He rolled the empty cart past the staff room and noticed a chair pulled out, a half banana, and a humming refrigerator. He did not see the manila folder, and he could not say whether the copier stacks had been moved inside. Family interviews indicate Janine planned a weekend trip to Auburn to see an old roommate who waited at a cafe. The roommate sent a message at 6, then another at 7, and assumed traffic had slowed the drive. When no reply came by 9, she called the district number on the website and reached voicemail. She filed a welfare check request, which appears in dispatch logs at 9:23, triggering the evening response to the campus. A teacher from a neighboring classroom said she found a sticky note under a stapler on the following morning. The note read that a parent conference needed rescheduling after a sibling pickup issue, and the signature looked like Janine's line. Investigators never confirmed whether the note was written that day or earlier in the week, and light smudges complicated analysis. The pen used matched office stock pens that many staff share, which limited any useful tracing of ink purchase records. A local who walks dogs near the fence line reported hearing a short whistle from the garden area around 4:10. He thought it was a child imitating a bird and did not approach the gate, which often sticks near the latch. He later wondered if it signaled someone, though investigators cautioned against building narratives from faint memory. His statement was filed, and the report notes residual mower noise from a neighbor's yard that could mimic a whistle. State records confirm that Janine held a valid credential, and her evaluations listed steady classroom management with consistent routines. Her attendance from January through May showed 2 personal days for dental work and 1 sick day after a winter cold. Payroll noted a pending stipend for after-school tutoring, which had not yet been issued when the year closed. None of those items suggested sudden resignation, and investigators emphasized that employment indicators can mislead when other pressures build quietly. During summer, crews replaced the east exit hinges and repainted the breezeway where varnish had peeled under repeated heat. A maintenance supervisor said the project had been scheduled earlier and supplies were ordered before the school year ended. Some locals claimed the timing erased scuffs that might matter, though county guidelines require routine upkeep before fall. Investigators never confirmed whether any scuff carried evidentiary value, and photos in the file show only generalized wear. In September of that year, hikers reported a neatly folded cardigan near a turnout on Mosquito Road beyond the river. Deputies collected it and noted size and label, which aligned with a brand Janine favored in photos from field trips. The cardigan carried no traceable tag to the store, and rain had passed, which softened any residue on the fabric. The lab report listed indeterminate results, and records conflict on whether the color matched one seen in her classroom drawer. A tip line produced calls about a blue jacket figure seen near the staff room, but descriptions varied by height. One caller remembered a limp, another mentioned a ball cap, and a third thought the zipper shone under fluorescent light. Investigators compared the accounts, and they never confirmed whether those details refer to a single person or several passers-by. The vending machine vendor list showed restock on Tuesday, not Thursday, which complicates assumptions about who lingered in that corner. As the year turned, the district reassigned the classroom and boxed the remaining supplies for storage in a locked cage. A new teacher unpacked the math notebooks after winter break and found a roster with penciled updates beside surnames. The updates matched Janine's handwriting according to a reading specialist who trained with her, though the dateline is blank. The specialist gave a statement that she last saw Janine at lunchtime on Thursday, standing by the copy room doorway. A brief item ran in the local paper referencing a missing teacher, and it led with courteous language about community support. The article cited the sheriff and the principal with spare quotes, and it named the school without giving the address. Comments online drifted toward speculation about roadways and footpaths, which investigators discourage when maps can mislead. That caution appears in archived notes from early briefings, and the phrasing repeats across updates released over the next months. By spring of the next year, the case summary condensed into a timeline that begins with the morning entry swipe. It lists classroom activities through dismissal, notes the copier running, places Arthur in the South Hall, and places Samuel near the library. It marks the unverified blue jacket sighting, the unlogged service gate area, and the sedan parked by the flagpole when dusk settled. Then the line ends with the phone ping drop and a blank field where investigators wrote pending until further leads arise. Some locals claimed they saw her hiking on weekends near Cronin Ranch, yet trail cameras never placed her there. Others believed a rideshare picked her up near the loop, but state records show no relevant trips in that time. Theories about staff conflicts appear in informal threads, and investigators never confirmed any disputes that fit the timeline. The available documents lean toward quiet routine turning into absence, and the file holds that shape without stating a cause. The district still keeps her name in older newsletters stored on a public folder that parents browse during enrollment. There are photos of book fairs and science night tables, and in one image, she adjusts a poster while students grin. None of the images show unusual visitors, and timestamps land months before late May, which narrows their significance. The folder remains a reference point for volunteers who remember that spring and for families who ask about the old garden. The classroom has new posters now, and the breezeway smells like wax again when summer arrives and heat rises. Children run toward buses, teachers wave with clipboards, and the office printer chugs through permission slips that stack on the counter. A sign near the garden asks people to keep the gate closed, though the latch still feels loose on windy afternoons. The story remains mostly paper and recollection, anchored by dispatch logs and sober lines that leave the ending open. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report, claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The 6th, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout. The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news wanted the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at 2 different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment, the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sublevel fans. Only a few workers even knew the sublevels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in two places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it, but one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between two readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m. The same moment the camera went dark. The Bridge Creek drowning that wasn't recorded. Locals in Deschutes County still mention a cold evening on Bridge Creek when a man vanished without an official entry. Witnesses later argued over the hour and the light while the water ran clear and slow beneath alder shade. The only certainty, according to archived notes kept in Bend, was that the call for help never landed where it should. The gap in paperwork turned an ordinary search into a puzzle that keeps reappearing in winter conversations. The man most often named was Trent Avery, 42, contract carpenter, in the area to price repairs on a seasonal cabin. He reportedly arrived 2 days earlier and slept in his truck near Sisters to save money, according to a motel clerk. The cabin owner said he never signed in or asked for a key because daylight was already fading near the ridge. The owner told deputies he expected a text that never came, which is a detail that repeats across later statements. Avery met one person that afternoon, a fisheries tech named Mara Collins, 34, state employee, checking culvert screens along a Forest Service spur. She said the creek looked safe for a crossing at the ford, which remained shallow where gravel spread across 2 tire lanes. Her state records log for that date lists water clarity as good and current speed as moderate with no debris above the culvert. She remembered a white cooler in his truck bed and a neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. Dispatch logs from that week show wildfire smoke along the highway and intermittent tower issues between Sisters and Camp Sherman. A technician wrote that calls sometimes hopped east before returning, which could explain later confusion over which county heard the first report. A private tower contractor filed a brief noting brief resets during the evening hour when shadows lengthened across the creek. The record is not a smoking gun, but it sits near the time window witnesses describe. Collins said she left him near 5 while the light still held, and the ford looked routine for any cautious driver. She told investigators he waved and asked about the old bridge pilings that stick from the bank near the bend. She reportedly replied that the pilings belonged to a logging ramp that washed out when storms changed the channel 2 winters back. She did not recall him stepping into the water or walking the gravel bar to test the footing. State records list a cloud front moving in from the northwest with cooler air that sometimes makes breath show at dusk. A ranger out of Sisters wrote that the creek often looks tame until a beaver dam upstream lets a pulse slide through. That can raise water a few inches quickly, which becomes meaningful in a narrow crossing where tires already press wet stones. The ranger did not say this happened that night, only that such pulses occur without sound along that reach. The first missing person alert does not exist in the county file from 2009, though later forms reference an original call. One deputy said the form might have been faxed to a non-emergency line that stopped accepting overnight traffic. Another deputy thought a visitor probably dialed from near the highway and hit the wrong jurisdiction due to the tower skip. The absence of a timestamp feeds the theory that information arrived in pieces and never landed in a single folder. 2 anglers claimed they saw a dome light blinking near the ford sometime after dark while the truck sat angled to the bank. They argued about whether the engine idled or whether they only heard water sliding against stones under the alders. Some locals claimed a third person approached the scene on a bicycle and left without speaking, though investigators never confirmed such a rider. Their statements match on the dome light detail and diverge on almost every other point. Avery's sister later provided archived notes from his phone bills that show attempts to call a bend number around 8. The number belongs to the cabin owner who had already driven home to Redmond and silenced his ringer above the garage. Records conflict on whether a voicemail ever arrived because the carrier log shows activity while the device log shows only a missed call. The discrepancy is small yet meaningful when trying to place a voice in a narrow hour along the creek. Searchers walked both banks at first light and found boot tracks that entered from the gravel bar and faded where cobble turned firm. A tape measure and a photograph shows a stride that stays even then shortens near a shallow channel cut by the previous week rain. They recovered the white cooler 50 yards downstream, caught against willow roots, with the lid unlatched but nothing inside. The jacket remained on the passenger seat exactly as Collins described, which adds a quiet weight to her timeline. A retired deputy who reviews Coldfield files said the map grid for the initial sweep sits 1 square too far east. He blamed a habit of copying last season templates during busy weeks and missing small shifts in volunteer practice. That oversight pushes a key waypoint off the creek, which could explain why a thermal search missed a figure in the brush. He did not frame this as proof that someone waited there, only that the error changed where people looked first. In later interviews, a hardware clerk in Sisters remembered Avery buying a short toe strap and a shovel with a fiberglass handle. The clerk thought he mentioned a soft approach near a ford where ruts filled and needed a few minutes with a blade. The receipt time lines up with Collins and the ranger notes, which places him near the creek before dusk with reasonable tools. The purchase does not prove a crossing attempt, yet it keeps the possibility within a narrow band of motives. A volunteer firefighter described a call that almost arrived, a carrier ping that appears in a phone report but not in dispatch logs. He said the station door was open for inventory and the tone speakers clicked once without the usual follow message. He wrote his memory down years later for a training handout, which makes it more story than record. Still, several younger volunteers say they heard similar clicks during that month when the tower resets annoyed crews. Divers checked a pool downstream where the channel tightens and lifts small whirl lines against a rock rib under the bank. Visibility stayed poor due to fine silt stirred by a mid-morning wind and a brief flow rise from upstream wetlands. They found no clothing or wallet and no keys, which matches the detail that the truck cab stayed unlocked at the scene. The diver lead said the bottom felt mostly smooth with scattered roots that would have caught a heavy object easily. Weeks later, a property survey crew flagged a scrap of fabric trapped on barbed wire near a floodplain meadow. The piece looked like work pant material and carried fine silt that stains in the specific way Bridge Creek water does. A lab in Salem could not confirm much beyond weave and color range, which overlaps with common brands used by local contractors. The finding neither closes the case nor clears any doubts about the unrecorded call that started the confusion. Avery's truck eventually left the impound lot and returned to family after a modest court order that resolved a storage dispute. The odometer reading suggested little movement beyond the approach and the short angle found by deputies at first light. Tire pressure on the right front ran low enough to pull a light vehicle toward the wet edge during a cautious attempt. A mechanic said that detail matters only if a driver felt rushed and chose not to air up before crossing. Some residents claimed he might have walked out before midnight after losing patience with the patchy calls and weak signal near the ford. Others said a car picked him up on the highway and drove north toward Warm Springs, a route that thins quickly after dark. Investigators never confirmed either thread because camera coverage along that stretch remains limited and cash purchases leave quiet trails. The two stories survive because neither collides with the evidence found by the creek. Years after the search, a regional auditor reviewed communications procedures and noted that inter-county coordination improved during the next season. The report mentions additional training with tower vendors and a shared checklist when pings show cross-jurisdiction drift for emergency calls. None of that resolves where Avery went, yet it addresses the blank square where his first alert should have lived. The lesson sits quietly in meeting minutes while the creek keeps moving stones along the shallows. The file remains open in a narrow sense with periodic review when new hikers report odd finds in willow tangles after spring runoff. Most of those reports fade after a deputy drives out and looks where grass has already leaned and lifted again. The absence of a recovered body keeps speculation tethered to polite voices in diners near the highway and the mill. The story persists because the paperwork gap made a simple night on a small creek feel like an argument that never ends. The stories. What stayed behind in this motel room window? The room was standard. 2 beds, a humming wall unit, and a window that faced the parking lot where big rigs idled through the night. What didn't look standard, once the sun rose low and flat, was the faint writing that only appeared across the glass at a shallow angle backward, patchy, like a message scrubbed hard but not gone. Rhea Mallory, 37, an insurance field adjuster on a week of hail damage claims, noticed it as she packed. She had meant to drink the motel's thin coffee, make 2 calls, and hit the interstate before the heat came up. The plan wobbled when the gold light caught on the pane and stitched a sentence out of streaks. She leaned close. 3 words. Reversed. As if intended for someone outside. The first resolved quickest. He. The second took longer. Was. The third broke into stuttered islands before joining. Here. Rhea didn't trust hunches for work, but she did trust her eyes. The glass held something that wanted to stay. She touched the pane with her knuckle, careful not to smear. The letters were not marker or paint. They looked like oil lifts, the kind that come from fingers pressed to a clean surface, then wiped without full success. Years of photographing dent patterns and windshield webs had made her look for directionality, downstrokes, stopping points. The H's verticals were heavier at the top. Somebody had reached up to write it. The height matched a kid, maybe a small teenager, maybe someone standing on a heel. The backward presentation meant whoever wrote it had been inside the room, not out in the lot. Rhea stepped back, then forward again, catching the angle to reread. He was here. It wasn't much by itself. Still, it clicked against something she half remembered. A flyer she'd seen in a gas station along this same highway, western Nevada. a wide run of sage and salt flat about a kid who had vanished years ago, last seen near an old roadside motel. The details on the flyer had been faded and generalized, and she hated the feeling of turning strangers into puzzles. But the message on the glass wouldn't let go. She snapped a photo, then another with the curtain pulled halfway to throw side shadow. Insurance habit. She set her phone on the sill and made a line in her notebook, room 23, North Building, roadside motel off the state route near the truck stop, morning light from the east. She added the date in her own style, early September of 2011, because she'd learned that memory softens the edges of time. Down at the front desk, a man with the posture of a coiled garden hose slid a receipt across the counter. He wore a shirt with a stitched name. Denton Kroll, property manager. He had the long stare of someone who had solved the same small problems for too many seasons. Rhea mentioned the window, casual like it was a maintenance note. Cleaning streaks, Kroll said. Windex when the sun hits. He tapped the desk with a capped pen. Happens. Could be, she said. It looks like words, though. Backward, like someone wrote from inside. People do all kinds of things to glass, he said, not looking up. Kids breathe and draw hearts. Guests leave handprints. Our crew wipes it down. Since when have you managed this place? Rhea asked. Still casual. Late 2000s, he said. Before that, it was old Mr. Levitt's. He let things slide. We've replaced a lot of panes, Truth told. He would not say more, and she didn't push. It wasn't her business. She was there for roof photos and the Dent farm on a fleet of sedans. But curiosity has a way of hiring a seat beside duty. Back in the room, she stood the motel stationary on edge to catch more oblique light. The letters resolved again. She took a slow breath, then put her phone on voice memo not to narrate, just to capture the ambient hum and her measures. A trick a photographer had taught her to anchor memory later. The air smelled like old cleaner and the metal tang of the window track. Her internal clue came by accident. When she slid the curtain fully open, the bottom hem snagged on a plastic spacer in the aluminum frame. The spacer was cracked, held with a sliver of old tape. The tape wore a different sheen than the rest of the frame. Brittle amber with torn fibers pressed into it. On top of that tape, ground into the glue, lay a tiny fleck of blue wax, the kind cheap crayons leave. Someone had taped something in place, maybe a page, maybe a label long enough for wax to settle. It matched the backward writing. If a sign had ever been stuck there, it would read correctly to the room. She wrapped the little tape shard in the motel stationery. Not as evidence she wasn't law enforcement, but because it felt wrong to leave it to a vacuum head. She took macro shots of the frame, the spacer, the wax fleck, and the area of glass where the words showed best. Then she checked out, turned in her keycard, and drove to the first claim 2 towns over. She told herself it would end there. It didn't. At lunch in a diner with counter stools and a corkboard of lost puppies and church suppers, she asked the waitress if the motel had any stories. The waitress, thin braid, name tag reading, Paloma rolled her eyes. Depends on your appetite, Paloma said. Folks, stop, sleep, leave. Years back, a trooper sat there with coffee for a week straight. Didn't say why, just watched the door. Remember when? Rhea asked. Late 90s? Maybe early 2000s? Paloma said. Time fuzzes. He had a name like Otero, or something like that. People said a kid was missing. No one talked specifics. Rhea looked at her phone photos again in the car. He was here. She tried to leave it alone. That night, at another motel 2 counties away, she gave in and called the number on a public information page she found for the State Highway Patrol. A desk officer forwarded her to a sergeant who handled cold inquiries. She left a measured voicemail, using evidence terms that felt correct to her station. I'm calling about a motel window in Western Nevada. Room 23, North Building. There's old oil-lifted writing that reads he was here when viewed at an oblique angle. There's also tape residue with blue crayon wax embedded in a spacer on the frame. I'm not asserting anything, just saw it, photographed it, and thought it might matter if there were any archived calls tied to that property. A day later, a woman called back, voice steady, words spare. She introduced herself as Sergeant Mara Vickery. Rhea put her on speaker and laid out exactly what she'd seen in order. Vickery didn't indulge or discourage. She asked for the photos and the exact position of the room relative to the parking lot. She also asked about the condition of the glass scratches, chips, or a logo in the corner that would indicate the manufacturer and tempering date. Rhea checked. The corner carried a faint etched mark. She had to tilt it hard to read. She wrote it down. Vickery hummed. The way someone does when a thing aligns with a file in memory. Here's what we have, reportedly, Vickery said. In late spring of 1999, a teenage boy traveling with extended family was reported missing along that corridor. Last confirmed sighting was a convenience store, 2 exits from your motel. Dispatch logs note a search and a hotel canvas. Witness statements varied. No sign. The case is cold, not active. We do not discuss names. Her tone made a boundary plain without being harsh. I'm not asking for any names, Rhea said. I can send you everything. One more thing, there's a crack in the plastic spacer on the frame that's been taped over for a long time. The tape is ambered. There's blue crayon wax ground into it that felt like it was from inside, not outside. Copy that, Vickery said. Send what you have. Rhea sent the photos with a short note. She expected silence. Instead, Vickery called again the next afternoon. The mark you read on the glass etching is interesting, the sergeant said. It indicates the glass was manufactured in 2003. The motel you stayed in? Our old notes suggest it had original panes at the time of the search in 1999. So, if the panel in room 23 was replaced sometime after 2003, whatever writing you saw could predate that replacement only if transferred in some way. More likely, the writing was made after 2003, meaning the message came later than the disappearance, Rhea said. Most likely, Vickery said. This isn't a TV turn. It doesn't solve anything. But it revises assumptions about timeline and occupancy. It suggests someone connected, or someone who wanted us to think they were connected, came back to that room after 2003. We would need maintenance records to know exactly when the glass went in. It made sense, and it did not hand her any drama. It did offer direction. Rhea drove back after her last claim and asked for Kroll again. She didn't pretend she had authority. She did not hint at leverage. She simply showed the macro photo of the etching and the cracked spacer and asked if he had any records on window replacements. Kroll rubbed his jaw as if checking for new bones. We replaced a batch after a wind event, he said. Glass was whistling. I'll look. He returned with a gray file folder crusted with Post-its. Inside sat stapled invoices with dates in the margins. Early August of 2007, Units 12 through 24, North Building. Supplier, Lima's Glass Service. Installer initials? You mind if I photograph these? Rhea asked. Knock yourself out, Kroll said, and for the first time, he looked tired in a way that wasn't irritated, just human. The external confirmation came when Rhea called the number on one of the old invoices and got a man answering on the second ring. Lima's, he said. Hector speaking. He remembered the job, long run of aluminum frames that had gone chalky from sun, Hector Limas said. We swapped panes and spacers where needed. I had to rig a few things because the sill channels were bent. We didn't touch curtains. New tempered glass stamped 2003 because that's what the distributor had bulk. Do you remember room 23? Rhea asked, knowing the question was broad and that memory is a wide net. Vaguely, he said. I remember one where the inside of the glass looked fingerprinted even after cleaning. We assumed someone had handled the pane before it cured. The housekeeper complained the smears came back in certain light. We used ammonia. It didn't fully lift. That's not unusual. Oils can ghost. Did you ever see writing in the oil? She asked. Could've, he replied. I don't read windows for stories. We replaced what was cracked. You're talking ghosts. They happen. If you think it's more, tell the troopers. She had already done that. She thanked him and wrote his comments down exactly, adding reportedly and remembered vaguely, because precision and humility can keep a story honest. Over the next week, Rhea kept doing her real job, hail dents, roof lines, signature blocks, while she let the window gather its own weight. The sergeant called one more time to say they had pulled the motel's old work orders. The pane in room 23 had been replaced in early August of 2007, matching the invoice. Maintenance logs around that month showed a housekeeping note. Writing keeps showing on 23 window. Tried vinegar. Still shows in morning. That note was funneled through a retired dispatcher named Sella Winters, who had saved a cardboard banker's box of old shift printouts, the way certain people keep the world from slipping because they know it tries. A quiet logic emerged. The boy missing from 1999, and there was never a name spoken, could not have written "he was here" on a piece of glass installed 8 years later, unless he returned. That didn't guarantee that he had. The message could have been a relational echo, a cousin, a friend, someone marking grief. But the tape shard and the wax fleck told another piece. The blue wax had come from a cheap crayon, likely pressed while paper was taped inside the frame. That suggested a small person sitting there, drawing, or someone steadied a page while trying to line up letters against the glass. The residue was on the inside spacer, not outside. That meant a moment happened in the room, not on the lot. Vickery asked a small favor that Rhea could do without crossing lines. Return to the room and try to lift a better photograph with crosslight. Rhea booked herself back into the motel on her own dime at the tail end of a loop. She requested 23 and got it after a shrug from Kroll. She came prepared with nothing fancy, just a black foam board to bounce light and a cheap angled flashlight from a hardware store. When the first edge of sun moved off the far hills, the letters bloomed again. She fixed the angle with books and the foam board, then took a series at different exposures. In 2 of them, a smudge sat low and right. Below the third word, barely a mark unless you expected it. It looked like a short curve with 2 dots and a drag. Rhea stared until she understood what shape it wanted to be. A crude smiley face, the kind drawn in 3 seconds by distracted hands. In the room notebook, decades old, Sella Winters had jotted a dispatch aside in 1999 that mentioned the kid's habit of drawing quick smiley faces in margins when nervous, according to a teacher's comment taken by phone. That was not proof. It was a soft echo between 2 separate things. Still, the echo categorized itself as relevant. When Rhea sent the new images, Vickery didn't tell her it solved anything. She said, "This tightens the inference that whoever made the marks had knowledge of the kid's habits or was the kid. It also keeps the time frame post-2003. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A pane installed in early August of 2007 kept showing lifted writing when morning light hit right. Housekeeping noticed. The content read, "He was here," and, in some readings, a simple face below. Tape residue and a crayon fleck lived on the interior spacer. Maintenance logs matched the install. A glazier remembered ghosted oils. Dispatch logs from 1999 contained an aside about a kid's doodles. None of that made a clean line to cause. It did what good detail does. It removed a few wrong lines. The twist, quiet but firm, landed 2 months later. Not for Rhea's benefit, and not with fanfare. Vickery called to let her know that, in reviewing archived calls surrounding the motel, a short anonymous tip from late summer of 2007 had been found. The caller, whose voice was masked by the crush of a payphone, had said only, "Check the north building, 2nd floor, room by the ice machine. Mornings show messages." The number had been a dead end then. The note sat in the file without connection because no one had compared it to the install logs. Now they matched. The pane had just been replaced. The message, then, could not be a relic from before the disappearance. It was a marker laid down later, possibly by someone who had returned to a familiar place to say something without saying much at all. Rhea asked the only question she could. "Does this help?" "It helps me not waste time on a wrong year," Vickery said. "Sometimes that's the whole gain." And that was it. No chase, no doors kicked. Instead, a timeline corrected by what stayed behind in a motel room window. Rhea didn't tell the story to anyone who would make it into a campfire shock. She kept the tape shard in a small envelope with the word motel and the date in her hand, even though she knew it had no chain of custody value. It wasn't evidence for court, it was gravity for memory. On her last pass through that stretch of highway before winter, she pulled into the truck stop at dusk and watched the north building of the motel throw its square lights into the lot. The window of room 23 held the look of any other. A woman in a denim jacket let down the blinds. A kid ran past, dragging a suitcase that clicked over seams. None of them knew what the glass had whispered. That felt right. A real story refuses to belong to whoever tells it the loudest. Rhea stood there until the sodium lamps came up and turned everything the same, tired amber. The hum of diesel engines filled the air, the kind of sound that flattens thought. She thought briefly of the words someone had pressed there with damp fingers and of the faint, silly face below. Not testimony, not confession, just a note at the exact height of a small person trying to leave proof of a breath. The truth in it was not the grand kind. It was the modest, late kind, the kind that lets people who do this work say later, with care, that a thing likely happened in a different month than everyone thought, and that a pane of glass, replaced in early August of 2007, had kept those mornings honest for years. She drove away without looking back, because looking back is for when there's nothing left to file. The motel settled into the dark, the window settled into shadow, and whatever stayed behind stayed there, just oil, just light, just enough. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered, as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Orta said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Orta said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ortis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding.